Some classic problems with the forms. Plato anticipated three significant problems with his forms, and presented these problems in the Parmenides. It might be wondered why Plato would present problems against his own view, but there are a variety of reasons why a philosopher would do this. One is just honesty. Philosophy aims to seek the truth, and the truth is not served by not considering potential problems for or objection against one's views. Secondly, of course, one has an advantage of bringing up problems on one's own when writing philosophy, because that way you're in control of the objection. And thirdly, it also shows that you've considered this objection, considered this problem, and presents the view that you are reasonable. So what are these three classic problems? The first problem is the problem of disgusting forms. Now, when Plato talks about the forms, it's always for these really wonderful things like justice, beauty, goodness, and so on. Parmenides asks if there are forms of hair, mud, filth, and so on. Now, these things exist. They have qualities and can be grouped under general terms, so they seem to meet the conditions for having corresponding forms. And consistency would seem to require that if we have a form of justice, we should have a form of injustice. If we have a form of beauty, we should have a form of ugliness. If we have a form of goodness, we should also have a form of evil. And if we have a form of, clean, we should have a form of filth. And we should also have forms for things like vomit and so forth. All of the, shower, mold, athlete's foot, and so on. So given his conditions, it would seem that we'd need to have such yucky forms. So why is this a problem? Well, the existence of such yucky forms would seem to clash with the notion that the forms are ideal and perfect, because, filth and mud and vomit don't seem ideal and perfect. Now, one way to try to work around this, and it's something that's adopted later, in the Middle Ages, in regards to the problem of evil, is to take the seemingly yucky qualities or negative qualities to be privations, to not be an actual thing that something has, a quality something has, but simply a lack of some positive quality. So injustice wouldn't be a thing that is a form, it would be a lack of justice. Ugliness wouldn't be a form, it'd be a lack of beauty. Evil wouldn't be a form, but would be a lack of good. And so filth would be a lack of, clean. And so that would seem to work in some cases. But filth and mud and vomit don't seem to be a lack. They seem to be things that could be grouped. So another way to deal with this problem is to do what's called biting the bullet and simply accept, okay, there's forms of mud, filth, vomit, pond scum, shower mold, all athlete's foot, all that stuff. And to simply accept that. And one could say that although to us mud and filth seems yucky, to others it would seem, quite good and wonderful. Think of the warthog pictured here. They would probably really enjoy, the vision of the Platonic form of mud, because that warthog seems to be really enjoying that mud. So it could be the case that these seemingly awful forms would be just fine. Next objection is the problem of participation. Now, the particulars are supposed to participate in the forms, and this is presented as somewhat of a metaphor. And the question arises, since there's just a single form for all of the many things, so one form of beauty for all beautiful things, one form of human for all human things, one form of justice for all just things, how does one form get instantiated, get manifested in the many things? Now, one limit on the forms is that they can't be broken into parts, so that each particular gets a piece of the form. So they're not like a pizza where you could like slice it up and everyone gets a slice of pizza. So it's not that beauty gets broken up into little chunks and everybody gets like, a bigger or smaller chunk of beauty. Because the forms aren't breakable. The whole form also cannot reside in each particular. Why? Well, a couple reasons. One, the forms are supposed to be transcendent. They're not here. Secondly, if the form were wholly present in each particular, and each form is perfect, then it would seem that each particular would have to, manifesting wholly the form, would be perfect as well. So if every beautiful thing had the form of beauty in its entirety, it would seem to be perfectly beautiful. So problem. So what Plato does, speaking through Socrates, is draw an analogy to sunlight. It is one light that illuminates everything without being divided or diminished. Parmenides counters with an analogy of his own, so we get a war of analogies. And his analogy is of a sail covering people. Each person is covered by a part of the sail, leading to the problem that each particular instantiates or manifests a fragment of the whole, which would be a problem for Plato's view. So we have a clash of analogies, and we come down to a battle of intuitions as to which is the most appealing. And other arguments, of course, could be advanced in favor of either Plato's view or Parmenides' view. The third problem, appropriately enough, is the classic third man. Not the movie, but the original third man problem. And here's the problem. Suppose we have two men, George and John. Now in Plato's account, they're both men because they participate in the form of man. So there's a form of man that groups George and John as men. Why are they both men? Well, form of man. But if the form of man makes George and John men, in this case, they would be the first man. Then in virtue of what are they similar to the form of man, which would be the second man? So the problem here is this. If George and John are both grouped as men because they participate in the form of man, then we'd have to raise the question of, we've got George, John, and the form of man, who are all men, so in virtue of what are they all men? So we need a form of man, which would be the third man. So you'd have George, John, then you'd have the form of man, grouping them, then you have the form of man, grouping all of them. Now this would start an infinite regress. Like we saw in the case of Zeno's paradox. In order to cover the distance, you take an infinite number of steps. Now in this case, for each form you have of a particular level, we'll call this level n for some number, you need a form of a level of n plus 1. That is, for each level of form you got, you need another form above that to group them. So if you have George and John, you need form 1 to group them. Then you need form 1 to group George, John, and form 1 you need form 2. And to group George, John, form 1, form 2, you need form 3. And to group George and John and form 1 and form 2 and form 3, you need form 4, and so on to infinity and beyond. And this is a problem for two reasons. One, participation would never be explained. It would remain an unexplained mystery. Secondly, and perhaps more seriously, it would prevent participation from ever taking place. Again, going back to when we talked about Zeno and the infinite amount of steps required to reach any point. For every grouping, you need another form to group them, and so it would go on forever, which means you would have no grouping because you need an infinite number. You can't have that, so it wouldn't work. So how can this be solved? Well, there's a couple ways. One is just to leave it as primitive and say, don't have to explain it, don't have to account for it, I'm taking it as primitive and paying the cost, which is a legitimate move, as we saw when we talked about the methods of metaphysics. And as long as the price is paid, that's acceptable, although there is the price. Another option is to claim that there's a principal distinction between grouping George and John, that the form groups them, but the form itself, although it's the form of man, it doesn't require another form to group them all together, because they're not all the same thing, which is probably the most plausible approach. Some other problems? Now, since the forms are supposed to be transcendent, there is this mystery problem, a mysterious gap between the forms and the material world. Now, one implication of this is it's super mysterious, so higher cost to the theory. It just seems, to many critics, including myself, that it's just inexplicable how this could happen. Another problem, though. This transcendent nature of the forms, and the importance placed on them, seems to devalue the material world, the world we live in. Because if what matters is the forms, and we get all our knowledge when we're communing with the forms, and this world is imperfect and terrible, and the world of the forms is perfect and, great, perfect, then a good question would be is what's the value of this world? Why is this world even here? I mean, Plato does have a creation story, but it does raise that question, what's the point of all this? Another problem is the epistemic supremacy of the forms reduces the value of the physical sciences. Why? Well, going back to Plato's epistemology, the only thing you can know, in the strict sense of knowledge, is the forms. And so the physical world being changing and imperfect is not knowable. So, given his view, the physical sciences that deal with this world cannot yield knowledge. They can yield beliefs that are supported by, better and worse arguments, but not knowledge. Now, how can this be addressed? Well, there's a variety of ways to do this. One is that, go to Aristotle. Aristotle tried to solve this problem. Another option is to, again, bite the bullet and say, yep, you can't have knowledge of the physical world, but you can have pretty good science. So go with the pretty good science, but we'll always have to accept that we can never know. And then, of course, the third option is trying to work out some way we can know physical stuff here, in an alternative epistemology, which could, of course, involve, giving up on Plato, which would kind of defeat the whole purpose of trying to address the objection. So what was Plato's importance? Well, the quotable quote about Plato is this. According to Alfred North Whitehead, a famous dead philosopher, well, famous then dead, he said the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato, which is pretty good praise. Next time we'll take a look at our friend Aristotle, but until then, stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.